Hello, listeners, and welcome to an emergency episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. I'm recording here on Monday, January 9th. It is slightly after noon Central Time here in New Orleans because I wanted to address the evolving situation and political crisis that is happening right now in Brazil. I don't have any Brazil experts in my network who I felt comfortable asking to come on the podcast on such short notice. If you are a Brazil expert and you're listening to this podcast and you'd like to come on and talk about it, please email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. But also in the new year, I wanted to do a few more of these solo type podcasts. So a lot of you have been asking for reaction to things that are developing in real time. So we're really experimenting here. And I'd love to know if you like this podcast or if you don't like this particular podcast. You can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments and tell me if you want more of this or if you want less of this. I'm not really sure, but we are going to give it a whirl. What happened? If you haven't been following the news or if you haven't seen the headlines, so thousands of Bolsonaro supporters, I should say, Jair Bolsonaro is the incumbent president of Brazil who lost the October 22 election. They stormed Brazil's Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidential palace. And there were these crazy videos over the weekend on social media of crowds damaging the interiors of those buildings and protesters demanding the imprisonment of Lula, who is currently the president. Lula came out and decried these people as vandals and neo-fascists and fanatics and said he was going to punish them as terrorists. Brazilian police have quickly regained control of those buildings. They detained over 1,200 people in Brasilia itself, and they've dismantled tent cities where Bolsonaro supporters were camping out. I also saw, and we'll get back to this in a second, that Lula met with the defense minister and the commanders of Brazil's armed forces. That's a very, very important meeting. But although there's a chorus of international leaders criticizing this as a quote-unquote assault on democracy, so far, if this is an assault, it's a pretty wimpy assault. It doesn't look to me like Brazil's democracy has been much threatened. But before we get to the analysis of the situation itself, and why I still remain fairly bullish on Brazil in the long term, and that in some way this crisis makes me even more bullish, let's just set up a little bit of the background. The background, I guess we should begin with President Lula, who first became president of Brazil in 2003 and governed Brazil from 2003 to 2010. When Lula first came into power, he really came in, it was a landslide. He won over 60% of the vote, and his Workers' Party had a plurality in both the Senate and in the Chamber of Deputies. And he really was a left-leaning figure who enacted a lot of important policies in Brazil. And a lot of people were afraid of Lula's policies when he first came into office, but he was actually pretty good for Brazil in the long term, even if Brazil built a dependence, I would say, on the export of commodities, specifically to the Chinese market, and in some ways turned its back, I think, on the project of South American economic integration. Lula became a disgraced president because he was eventually convicted of corruption charges, and he wasn't even allowed to run for political office again until that decision was annulled in 2021. I think that's an important point. Lula's never been exonerated of corruption. The results were just annulled on a legal technicality. So it's not like Lula is this shining white knight that everybody should rush to describe as a defender of democracy. This is also a guy who gave an interview to Time magazine early last year who said that Zelensky was in part responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This is someone also who thinks of Brazil as part of the BRICS, Brazil, India, China, South Africa, Russia, who thinks that Brazil needs to have a place as a standalone power of its own and doesn't really have a lot in common per se with, certainly not with U.S. interests or necessarily with other interests throughout the liberal democratic world. So that's Lula. Jair Bolsonaro is a whole nother thing. Jair Bolsonaro is, he's the Brazilian Trump. If you really want to reduce it down simplistically, he won the last Brazilian election pretty easily, but he's that populist demagogue. He says that he's pro-business. In actuality, his policies, he didn't mind giving government handouts and trying to affect or set fuel prices if it meant something for his electoral future. He likes to say crazy things. The craziest thing that I saw him say once was that he said that if you take the COVID-19 vaccine, it could turn you into a crocodile. I'm not sure whether that was tongue-in-cheek or not. It seemed stated rather unironically to me. But that's the type of person that Bolsonaro was. And the thing that I want to put in your mind that I don't think is being reported very much because there's so much focus on Lula and Bolsonaro is that even though Lula and Bolsonaro had a very, very tight election in October 2022, neither one of them won 50% in the first round, and Lula eventually prevailed with just 50.9% in the second round. So not a huge margin there by which he defeated Bolsonaro. But this is not 2003. This was not a leftist wave that brought Lula crashing back into power. Something like 60% of the Chamber of Deputies and a slight majority in the Senate have much more in common politically with Bolsonaro than they do with Lula. And Lula was already beginning to come against those political governing constraints. He wasn't going to be able to do what he did from 2003 to 2010 because Brazil has really changed. It is a place that is more conservative. It's more economically liberal. It was not going to sign up for the types of socialist or left policies that Lula was going to put through. And the fact that Bolsonaro was not able to win the second round of the election, there's two things you should keep in mind there. Number one, even though he is crazy, and even some of his supporters would tell you he is crazy, he was extremely close to winning. And just about any other political candidate in Brazil who had Bolsonaro's policies but didn't do all the crazy things that he does, I think probably would have won Brazil's presidential elections handily. There's an interesting parallel here between Brazil and the United States, and this is an idea I've been playing with for a long time. I think there are a lot of strange similarities between Brazil and the United States, not just in our politics today, but in the structure of those countries in general. If you go back hundreds of years, when Spanish and Portuguese colonizers came to the New World and when they got to South America, when they went to places like Peru or to Mexico, there was the Aztec Empire, there were the Incan empires, the Mayan empires. For all we know, there were not any large-scale civilizations in what is today Brazil. Now, some people will point to the lost city of Z. Some people will say I'm being disrespectful to the culture of the indigenous peoples that were there. I'm really not meaning to do that. My point is just that in the same way that in North America, most of the Native American population was wiped out or really couldn't push back against the English colonizers, I think that also happened to a certain degree in Brazil. There was no dominant power that the Spanish or the Portuguese had to conquer. And in general, that led to the creation of a real new identity in terms of Brazil. In the same way that the United States had manifest destiny and kept expanding out to the West, it was this new artificially constructed nation. I think Brazil was sort of the same. And Brazil is also a true melting pot in that sense. It's a group of a lot of different tribes and languages. And you've got the indigenous peoples, and you've got the colonizers, and you've got slave labor brought in from Africa. In that sense, there's a lot of similarities, I think, between Brazil and between the United States, and especially between Brazil and the American South. If you go back and look at history, there's a lot of weird connections between the Confederacy and Brazil. And even some Confederates ended up fleeing to Brazil because they thought that was a good environment for them after the U.S. Civil War. I've been playing with this idea that Brazil in some ways is what the United States might look like if it didn't have a civil war. If it had remained an agrarian, hierarchical society dominated by large landowning families for a long time. That never really happened in Brazil. You didn't have that kind of change where an industrial portion of the country was capable of dominating the rest of that. And so where the United States becomes this engine of industry and trade in the rest of the world, Brazil really lags behind the rest of the world for most of the 20th century. And in the latter half of the 20th century is governed in a series of military dictatorships and a bunch of military coups as well. So there's an interesting parallel there between Brazil and the United States at the very broadest macro level. But then in Brazil and U.S. politics today, you also have these sort of strange similarities. You've got Bolsonaro and Trump, these nominally center-right figures who are really populist demagogues and seem to be able to convince the poorest parts of society that they speak for them. They have that sort of same charisma. You have two very unequal societies. Inequality in Brazil is extremely high. Inequality in the United States is also very high. And you've got countries that really don't have any geopolitical rivals right next to them. Argentina is an economic basket case. Mexico and Canada pose no real threat to the United States. So in that sense, there's some very interesting synergies between Brazil and the United States right up to this political crisis. In the United States, obviously, we had the January 6th crisis. And what's happened in Brazil over the weekend looks like a version of the January 6th crisis to me. And that's where I have a little bit more optimism about what's happening in Brazil right now than maybe the rest of the world has. Because if this was an assault on democracy, It wasn't a particularly good assault on democracy. I always remember when I was in high school, I was in Israel, and I was talking to an Israeli cab driver, and we were I forget exactly what we were talking about, but somehow we got on the topic of extremists. And I'll never forget what he told me in Hebrew. He said the English translation is, in every house, there is a trash can. It doesn't matter how good your society is. It doesn't matter whether you're living in Nazi Germany or the People's Republic of China or the United States. You have good people and you have bad people and you have crazy people. In every house, there is a trash can. And in Brazil, there is a trash can. You have people who are going to go out there and are going to try to subvert democracy, who are going to vandalize government buildings, who are going to do all these sorts of things. But that is the fringe. The fringe is not the majority. And the majority of Brazilians, as far as I can tell, want no part of these crazy people. Bolsonaro himself, who apparently is chilling in Orlando, I don't know what he's doing in Florida, has already condemned the protest. He authorized a peaceful transition of power to Lula. Yes, he did a lot of sowing doubt about the integrity of Brazil's elections, that people with facile minds that want to latch on to these conspiracy narratives, like those are the people that are out there protesting. Most Brazilians are not like that. The Brazilian military has not come to the Bolsonaro supporters' defense. Bolsonaro supporters and the Brazilian government, they do not condone any of this. They have said they want to be a political opposition to Lula going forward. They don't want to usurp what they see as a legitimate democratic election. And that's the other important thing to see here. These people are on the fringe. The Brazilian police, as I'm talking right now, seem to have cleared most of the rabble-rousers from the situation. The Brazilian military and the top commanders of the Brazilian military, Bolsonaro was cycling in people that were supposed to be his loyalists, that were supposed to be sticking up for and defending him. They haven't done anything. They haven't intervened for Bolsonaro, and so far they haven't intervened for Lula either, and I think that's a really important thing to watch going forward. But right now, the Brazilian military is sitting on the sidelines, and that's what you want to see from Brazil. You want to see the Brazilian military depoliticizing itself. You want democracy in Brazil, however messy and volatile it's going to be, to continue to progress. You want to see the Brazilian economy continue to evolve in ways that it wasn't able to evolve last century. For me, all the reasons you should be bullish about Brazil are still the same, and it doesn't matter who the president is. Brazil is a continental-sized power that is located far away from areas of geopolitical tension. It is incredibly rich in commodities that the world is going to need. I was speaking at FarmCon in Kansas City last week, and before I went on, Peter Zeihan went on and gave his spiel about how pessimistic he was about Brazil in general. And one of the things I noted was all the farmers in that room were petrified of Brazil because they see how much Brazil is surging soybean production and corn production, and really in some ways out-competing the United States in some of these key commodities that U.S. exporters have always been competitive in. I really think Brazil is a country that can capitalize on the fact that it's the fifth largest in the world. It's the sixth most populous country in the world. Brazil has a lot of things going for it. So in general, when we think about Brazil going forward, all of those structural issues, those larger geopolitical issues, to me, they matter much more than the identity of whoever the Brazilian president's going to be. In the Cognitive Investments Global Situation Report analysis/forecast that I wrote right after Lula won the second round of the Brazilian election, I just want to read you this sentence that I wrote. I said, as long as a transition of power occurs, even if it is chaotic and even violent, it doesn't matter that much who governs Brazil for the next few years. It matters much more if the Brazilian government and ruling class is willing to enact policies that enable Brazil to tackle inequality, to raise living standards, and improve the quality of Brazil's infrastructure to take advantage of its myriad structural advantages. I said that even if Bolsonaro tried to stick around in office, and he didn't, this was not Bolsonaro. He does not seem to have at least officially, publicly condoned this. He has criticized this at every single step. His exact quote has been that Brazil needs to move forward. It can't be stopped right now. This is more like January 6th in the United States, not like Brazil's coup of 1964 or a reversion to political chaos in Brazil. So if you are optimistic about those longer-term fundamentals for the Brazilian economy, I wouldn't be scared away by what's happening in Brazil right now. This is what democracy looks like. If you are pessimistic about Brazil, I don't think it should be the short-term political volatility. If you are pessimistic about Brazil, you think that Brazil is not going to fundamentally change. You're going to point out that even though Brazil, as I said, it's such a huge country, it's only the 12th largest economy in the world in terms of GDP, which is smaller than Italy today. In terms of GDP per capita, the average Brazilian takes home less money than a citizen in Equatorial Guinea. Almost 30% of Brazilian people live in poverty, and this is the largest but most unequal country in all of Latin America, and inequality has actually come to record highs after the pandemic. Those are the structural reasons that if you think Brazil is not going to perform, it's because of that. It's not because of some kind of forceful right-wing turnover of a legitimate election. Now, all that sounds very rosy. That does not mean that I think that there aren't risks here. As I said, at CI, we've closed most of our Brazilian positions. We are looking for the right opportunity because we think Brazil is a long-term investment, not necessarily one in the short term, and we've taken a lot of risk off the table. That also said, there are a few key signposts that I'll be looking for that would make me change my mind or that would break my Brazil analysis of the Brazilian situation. The first is any formal intervention by the Brazilian military, whether on behalf of the government or on behalf of the anti-government protesters. If it's on behalf of the government, that means that the Brazilian police forces are not able to handle the situation themselves, and that either the Brazilian government calls in the military or, in a more worst case scenario, the Brazilian military decides it has to intervene to return stability to the system. By far the worst case scenario would be if the military begins to identify itself with the rabble that tried to take over the Congress and the presidential palace and the Supreme Court and intervenes to get rid of Lula and either reinstall Bolsonaro or some military leader in a military dictatorship. If you see a move in either direction, really, if you see Brazil's military start to take a much more political role in this conflict, I'm wrong. This Brazil analysis is wrong, and we'll be starting at scratch here at CI. The scenario that is more negative, that I think is more realistic, that I'm worried about, is that if Lula takes this moment and tries to use these impotent pro-Bolsonaro protests to purge the system of his opponents. As I said, Lula is facing a legislature that is ultimately hostile to his interests. Lula is not elected because of what he stands for. He got elected because of what he stands against. In that sense, here's another similarity with the United States. In the same way that Joe Biden offered a return to normalcy, to centrism, that's what Lula's offering to the electorate this time around. He was not offering sort of leftist fire and brimstone, communist socialist policies. He just said, let's not have a guy in office who thinks that the vaccine's going to turn you into a crocodile. Let's not have a guy who runs around and says all of these crazy things. Let's have some stability, some law and order in Brazil. He does not have the mandate, and I'm not even sure he has the energy as a 77-year-old man to go out and be a firebrand and go up against all these different constraints that he's going to have in Brazil if he wants to do these other things. Also, if you look at Brazil itself, it's a very divided country. Lula won most of the Northeast. The southern and central parts of the country went for Bolsonaro. Remember, this was a 1.8% margin in the presidential election, and that when it comes to the legislature, most of the legislature, or I should say the majority of the legislature, has more in common with Bolsonaro's policies than they will with Lula in general. So if we see Lula overstepping, if he gets delusions of grandeur about his political power, that this gives him some kind of mandate to crush the people that came after him, and he calls everyone who is a Bolsonaro supporter a terrorist and a vandal and a fascist, rather than just the couple thousand people that were out there doing stupid things in the streets, that could be very negative for Brazil in general. Last but not least, any unrest or state collapse that makes everyday life in Brazil less manageable. I talked with Rob before I recorded the podcast, and this is the one that he focused on. And it's more amorphous than the other signposts. It'll be pretty clear to me if the Brazilian military intervenes in this crisis. It'll be pretty clear to me if Lula goes wild and starts trying to use this to purge the system of his enemies. But if Brazil gets less manageable, that's the sort of thing that can go death by a thousand cuts. It's a little more subtle and really requires careful and constant monitoring of the situation. Again, though, I just refer back to an analysis which was really a forecast that we wrote back in November in the Global Situation Report, which was expect more political intrigue, more uncertainty, and more volatility out of Brazil in the years ahead, rather than a true return to normalcy. I think we're really looking at a period of volatility in Brazilian politics here. And one of the reasons I talk about Brazil so much is I think that dealing with that volatility and going through some of the structural and policy change that Brazil is undertaking, it's going to create interesting opportunities for the long term. Because in the long term, if I'm right about the multipolar world emerging by 2025 or sort of beyond there, then Brazil is a country that should do well as long as it doesn't go the way of Argentina. And despite all of the crises and despite all the fear mongering that we've seen over the weekend and into Monday, I really don't think that is what is going to happen. So I don't want you to get to the end of this podcast and think that I am condoning what the protesters did, or that I'm poo-pooing this and saying, oh, this is not a big deal. Why don't you go back to eating a cheeseburger or doing whatever you were doing beforehand? It is a big deal. Anytime there is a challenge to a transition of power in a democracy as important in the world as Brazil, that's something you should stand up in your chair and take note of. But I think broadly speaking, all of this should tell us good things about Brazil, because if, as I expect, these people who are out there doing these things are rejected by not just the Brazilian population, but by Brazil's leaders on both sides of the political spectrum, that should be a net positive for Brazil. And if we see Brazil is able to metabolize a political crisis like this without having to revert to a military dictatorship or military intervention, that should be a net positive. The disturbing thing here, of course, and this is in America's Quarterly, they published a great roundup of different viewpoints on what happened. And there was one comment from the managing editor at America's Quarterly that stayed home with me, which was, she said this was a crisis foretold. I thought that was an excellent way of saying at least some of the reason for this crisis is that Bolsonaro was selling this idea that Brazil's elections were rigged, that it was fraudulent, that there was no way that he was going to win. And even though he authorized the transition of power, and even though he's been against the protesters, I think Bolsonaro does bear some culpability for spreading that idea that the election was rigged and that the game was against him. Now, I don't think it got into the Brazilian mainstream. It didn't infect most of the ideas of most Brazilians, but I do think in most of the democratic world, we are beginning to doubt our institutions. We doubt what the media is telling us. We seek out the media channels that tell us what we want. If the politicians that we support are not the ones in power, we assume that the politicians in power are ruthless and out to get us. And most of the evidence tells us that is actually what's going on as well. So there is this sort of broader degradation and trust in political institutions that is happening in the world over. And in that sense, this is a really critical moment, because if Brazil does succumb, if one of these signposts that I told you about does come up, and I'm wrong to be optimistic about Brazil, maybe this is just another benchmark on that way to the degradation of legitimacy of different democratic political institutions in the world. But right here today on January 9th, it's now about 12:32. That's not what I see. I really see this as a moment where Brazil faced a real threat, and that the majority of Brazilians just said, no, that's not us. And the police went and cleared it. And the Brazilian government here now has a chance. It can either govern with the kind of unity that Lula talked about when he governed, or he can use this as a way to try and punish his enemies. And that's the thing I'm most worried about. If Lula takes this as a way to punish his enemies, if he doesn't realize that he might have a chance here to heal some of the wounds in Brazilian society, to point to these crazy people and say, hey, if we don't come together, that is the future that is waiting for us. These people are a small minority right now, but if we can't work together, if we keep fighting against each other, that craziness, that anarchy is what is waiting at the end of it. I think that's a very powerful message, and in some ways could give Lula the political currency that he does not have right now, which he did not win at the ballot box. So those are my thoughts on Brazil right now. It's why I am still mostly bullish on Brazil, why we think of this as an opportunity, and we'll actually be looking for opportunities in Brazil here over the course of the next year or so. But I also go in with my eyes wide open. There's a lot here not to like. There are some key signposts that you need to watch that would invalidate my thesis. And again, I hope you get in my approach here that even though I think I'm right about this, I absolutely could be wrong. And in some ways, the most important part of geopolitical work is not coming up with a thesis. It's about coming up with what are the things that would make my thesis wrong. What are the things that would invalidate my thesis? If you can't invalidate a thesis, guess what? It's not a thesis. In the same way that if you can't invalidate a hypothesis in science, you're not actually doing science, you're not actually doing experiments. If you're in geopolitical analysis and you cannot invalidate a thesis, it's not a thesis. And if you don't do the important work of spending most of your time not on looking for the things that support your thesis, but looking at the things that break your thesis, then you're doing it wrong. Then you're just really out there to get clicks. So I think I'm right about this. I think that this will pass and we won't think about it very much, that in the sort of longer trajectory of Brazil's fundamentals will continue to march forward. But I'm not going to spend most of my time looking for data that supports that. I'm going to be spending most of my time scouring for indications that the Brazilian military is going to intervene. I'm going to be looking for signs that Lula is going to get vindictive on his enemies. And I'm going to look for signs that everyday life in Brazil is getting less manageable, or that Brazil is not able to make some of the important investments in infrastructure and logistics and things like that it needs to succeed in this multipolar world. Because the thing I'm most afraid of is that the thesis is wrong, not that you think that I got this exactly right in sort of the fog of the crisis here just a couple of days after it began. So I'll get off my heuristic soapbox there just to say that's the way you have to do geopolitical analysis in this world. Nobody is smart enough to get this stuff right out of the gate. The discipline is, can you take a step back? Can you soberly look at what is going on with a sense of irony, a sense of humor, without your own personal views about Bolsonaro or Lula getting involved? And then can you create an analytical model that allows you to understand what's going on in Brazil right now? So I gave you a sketch of my model here. If you are not subscribed for the Global Situation Report, a written version of that model will come out at the end of this week. I would have pushed it out sooner if I thought this was a bigger threat to Brazil, but I don't. I don't think it makes sense to change our written cadence, even if I'm coming to you here, to your ears, to tell you what's going on in Brazil right now. With that, I will get this podcast out the door. Hopefully we get it out this afternoon. If not, I'm sure we'll get it out tomorrow morning. Cheers, and see you on Friday for our normal weekly update. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.